$50 million gone in a single morning. The thunder of tanks shattered the streets of Washington, D.C., leaving scars deeper than cracked concrete. Empty bleachers, silent crowds. A parade meant to display strength exposed instead a nation's unease and division. And in that silence, one man stepped forward. J.D. Vance, a son of America's forgotten towns, made a choice that could change the course of history. Was this the moment our country's true strength was revealed? Or its greatest shame? The story you're about to experience is inspired by real events and real figures. But as with all great storytelling, we've added dramatization to explore the emotions, struggles, and hopes behind the headlines. The facts spark this journey, but the deeper truth lives in the questions we now ask together. And so, we invite you to walk this road, to reflect, and to see what strength truly means. Let's begin. Stay with us. The next chapter of this story may just change how you see strength, loyalty, and America itself. The first light of dawn spilled cautiously across Washington, D.C., its fragile glow reflecting off puddles left by a restless night of rain. The city, usually so proud beneath its marble monuments, now seemed to shrink beneath a sky still heavy with storm clouds. The air was thick with dampness and tension, a city holding its breath. Then from the distance came the low, grinding roar that made the ground itself tremble. Tanks, massive steel beasts, their paint dulled by the mist, lumbered onto Constitution Avenue. Each rumble sent tiny shockwaves rippling through the cracked asphalt, the ground groaning beneath their weight, 1,000 tons of iron and intention, rolling through the heart of the Capitol. The street glistened, not with glory, but with rainwater and oil, streaked like the face of a weeping giant. Empty bleachers lined the route, their metal frames cold and uninviting. Flags hung limp and wet, as if the city's spirit had soaked up the rain and sagged beneath its own disappointment. J.D. Vance stood apart, beneath the canopy of an old elm tree near the mall, his coat collar turned up against the chill. From his vantage point, he could see it all. The tanks, the hollow drum beats, echoing against the silent buildings, the cameras searching hungrily for a crowd that wasn't there. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades slicing the damp morning air, as if trying to stir life into a scene already written in regret. He clenched his fists inside his coat pockets, the leather of his gloves creaking softly, unnoticed amid the din. His heart ached in a strange, twisting way, a man torn between pride and dread. We wanted pride. We showed our cracks. The thought looped in his mind, bitter as the chill that seeped through his bones. On the far side of the avenue, a small boy, no more than 6, stood clutching his father's hand. His eyes were wide, too wide for such a small face, reflecting the steel monsters that crawled past. He tugged gently at his father's sleeve and whispered, his voice thin as the wind, "Why are they breaking the road?" J.D.'s gaze lingered on the boy. That question, so simple, so innocent, cut deeper than any headline or critic ever could. He could almost feel the boy's confusion, the unspoken fear behind those words. And still the tanks came. Each one left a scar, a gouge in the street, a reminder of cost without clarity. Cameras zoomed in on the tracks, the cracks, the empty seats. The world was watching, but what story were they seeing? J.D. felt the weight of it all pressing down. He had stood by the president's side, heard the arguments, the passion, the desperate desire to remind America of its strength. But here in the cold light of morning, strength looked like destruction. A show meant to unite seemed only to lay bare the fractures no parade could mend. And yet beneath it all, J.D. sensed something else, a question that no one dared to ask aloud. What comes after this? Was this the last gasp of an old idea of power, or the painful first step towards something new? Could the damage, visible and invisible, still be turned into purpose? J.D. didn't have the answers. Not yet. But as the last tank clattered past and the parade's hollow drum beats faded into an awkward, heavy silence, he knew this. The story wasn't over, and whatever came next would demand more than the steel and spectacle. It would demand truth. His eyes narrowed as he turned from the scene, heart pounding not from pride or shame, but from resolve. The world might see a failed parade today, But J.D. Vance would make sure that wasn't the end of the story. And somewhere above, the helicopters kept circling, as if searching for the real headline. As the final rumble of the tanks faded into the morning mist, J.D. Vance's mind drifted, not away from the moment, but deeper into it. The cold steel tracks scarring the city streets were not just the product of a single parade. They were the echoes of a decision made in a room that, despite its grandeur, had felt claustrophobic with the weight of expectation. The night before, the Oval Office had glowed in the soft amber light of the desk lamp. The storm outside had tapped against the tall windows, as if even the rain wanted to listen. J.D. had stood by the window's edge, gaze drawn to the dark silhouette of the Washington Monument beyond. But his focus kept pulling back to the man seated behind the resolute desk. Donald Trump's voice had filled the room, not loud but firm, steady, charged with a kind of urgency that left no space for hesitation. "Let them see our strength," Trump had said, his eyes burning with a mix of pride and defiance. "For too long, they've mocked us. The elites, the outsiders, the doubters. They think America's done. They think we don't have it anymore. But tomorrow they'll see." J.D. had listened in respectful silence. There was no mistaking Trump's passion, no mistaking the sincerity that many refused to see beneath the headlines. This wasn't vanity speaking. J.D. knew that. This was a man who felt his country's pride slipping away and wanted desperately to remind it of its power. A man who had walked through forgotten towns, seen the empty factories, the hollow eyes of workers left behind. Trump wasn't staging a show for himself, not in his mind. He was staging it for them, the people no one else seemed to see. And yet, as J.D. stood there, a heaviness had settled in his chest. Doubt. Not about Trump's heart, but about the means. Could a parade of steel and spectacle truly speak to the soul of a nation that needed hope more than it needed hardware? Could tanks and troops fill the void left by lost jobs, lost dignity? Or would it ring hollow, as empty as the bleachers that, even then, J.D. feared might greet the dawn? Trump had risen from his chair, walked to the window beside J.D., and together they looked out at the rain-slicked city. "You understand, don't you?" Trump had asked, quieter now. "We can't let them forget who we are." "I do, Mr. President," J.D. had replied, and he meant it. He understood the intent, the raw, aching desire behind it. But understanding wasn't certainty. And as he watched the tanks roll now, watched the scars they left in the street, J.D. felt that doubt settle deeper. Yet the memory of that night, of the storm, of Trump's voice and vision, held him in place. The world might see a flawed spectacle, but J.D. saw the man's heart behind it, the heart of someone fighting, clumsily perhaps, but earnestly, to remind America of itself. That was the thread that tied the night before to this cold, awkward morning. And it was that thread J.D. now clung to as he asked himself the hardest question of all. Could he take that intent, that vision, and help shape it into something real? The tanks had passed, the morning was still, but inside J.D. Vance, the storm had just begun. And as he turned from the empty street, boots splashing in shallow puddles that mirrored the fractured sky, his resolve hardened. Whatever came next, it had to honor not just the man's vision, but the people it was meant to lift. The storm in J.D.'s mind hadn't passed, not as the tanks clattered out of sight, not as the drum beats faded into an uneasy silence that settled over Washington like fog. The city, so often a stage for speeches and ceremonies, now felt hollow, as if the parade had drained it of its voice. The streets lay scarred, the once smooth asphalt split and crumbling where the steel giants had passed. Pools of water collected in fresh cracks, reflecting a fractured sky. J.D. stepped down from the curb, the soles of his boots echoing softly against the broken pavement. The morning's cold hadn't lifted, and neither had the weight on his chest. The echoes of Trump's words from the night before, "Let them see our strength," still rang in his ears. But what the world had seen, J.D. feared, was something far different. The media wasted no time. Even as J.D. walked, he caught glimpses through the windows of cafes, television screens flashing headlines in bold, unforgiving letters. Millions wasted on vanity parade, D.C. streets in ruins after military spectacle, empty seats, empty gesture. Footage rolled on loop, Tanks grinding forward past bleachers that stood barren, soldiers marching stiffly, their formation uneven, their faces strained. The anchors spoke with a mix of disbelief and ridicule. Commentary scrolled beneath the images like salt in a fresh wound. JD kept walking. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and wet concrete. He passed a section where a chunk of asphalt had broken clean away, exposing raw earth beneath the city's polished veneer. Without thinking, he crouched down and picked up a piece. A jagged shard of concrete, small enough to fit in his palm but heavy with meaning. He turned it over slowly in his hand, feeling the roughness bite against his glove, the weight of it grounding him in that moment. A crack in the street, he thought, a crack in the soul of the nation. The phrase came unbidden, but it stayed, lodged deep, as immovable as the guilt that tugged at him. He could hear, faintly, the hum of news helicopters still circling above, searching for what remained of the story, as if the damage might shift, might somehow look less damning from another angle. But there was no angle that could hide it, not from the cameras, not from the world, and not from JD himself. He imagined the boy from earlier, the one who'd asked his father why the road was being broken. That question haunted him now, more than any headline. It was a question JD couldn't yet answer. Not to the boy, not to the nation, not even to himself. But as he straightened, tucking the piece of concrete into his coat pocket, JD felt a spark of resolve kindle beneath the layers of doubt and regret. The parade was over. The spectacle had failed. The critics would feast on the moment. But the story, the real story, was still his to help write. And as he turned from the damaged avenue, the fractured city reflected in the puddles at his feet, J.D. Vance carried with him not just the weight of public failure, but the beginning of a mission not to cover the cracks, but to understand them, and maybe, just maybe, to find a way to mend them. As J.D. Vance walked away from the scarred avenue, the weight of that jagged concrete piece in his pocket felt heavier with every step. The city behind him was fractured. The nation's pride, it seemed, had cracked along with the streets. And yet, beneath the echo of failure, JD's mind kept circling back, not to the tanks, not to the empty bleachers, but to the man whose vision had set the parade in motion, a vision the world now mocked without understanding. In the quiet of that early hour, JD remembered the private conversations, the moments beyond the glare of cameras, when Trump's voice carried not bluster, but genuine frustration, the kind born of watching a nation forget its own heart. One night in particular came rushing back, clearer than the headlines flashing across cafe screens that morning. They had been in a small side room at a rally in Ohio, away from the noise of the crowd. Trump, tie loosened, eyes sharper than the caricatures on TV would ever admit, leaned in as if confiding a secret that weighed too much for one man alone. JD, he had said, his voice lower, stripped of its usual bravado. They don't see us anymore. The people who built this country, the people who keep it running, they've been forgotten. We have to remind them who we are. JD had nodded then, because he understood. Not the politics, not the spectacle, but the ache. He'd seen it in the shuttered factories, the abandoned main streets, the empty chairs at family tables, where jobs used to fill the space. Trump wasn't chasing applause. He was chasing something lost, something stolen by years of neglect. And that was what the parade was meant to be. JD knew it, even now, as the city's scars drew ridicule from news anchors and commentators who saw only the surface. They called it vanity. They called it waste. But they didn't see what JD had seen. That look in Trump's eyes, that relentless, sometimes clumsy, but always earnest desire to give the forgotten a reason to lift their heads again. JD clenched his fists in his coat pockets, feeling the weight of the concrete and the weight of that truth. The world would laugh today. They would pick apart every crack in the street, every misstep of a soldier out of sync. But they would miss what mattered most, the intent that had driven it all. Trump's words echoed again in JD's memory. We have to remind them who we are. That was no slogan, no soundbite for the cameras. It was a plea from a man who refused to let the heart of America fade without a fight. And so JD walked on, the city's cold morning air biting at his cheeks, but his resolve warming with every step. The cracks in the street, the jeers of the media, the hollowness of the parade. These were not the end of the story. They were only the beginning. He would defend that intent, not to the world that chose mockery over understanding, but to himself. Because somewhere beneath the failure of the morning lay a mission still worth fighting for. And J.D. Vance wasn't ready to let it die beneath cracked asphalt and bitter headlines. The cold air of the city still clung to J.D.'s coat as he stepped through the worn doors of the Veterans Center. The low hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, the shuffle of boots on old tile, all of it a world apart from the spectacle that had unfolded just hours before. The center smelled faintly of old wood and stronger coffee, a place that bore its age with quiet dignity. J.D. paused for a moment, letting the warmth of the room wash over him, before he moved further inside. The men and women gathered there were a tapestry of America's service, faces lined by years, backs slightly stooped by time or injury, eyes sharp with memory. Some had watched the parade on small, flickering TVs mounted in the corners. Others had listened on radios or simply heard the rumble through the city's bones. And their reactions, like the nation's, were mixed. A group near the window spoke in low tones, nodding as they recounted the tanks, the flag displays, the sheer force on show. "It felt good to see it," one said, his voice thick with pride. "Like the old days, like we meant something again." But at a table near the back, an older man sat alone, his hands wrapped around a chip mug. His sergeant's stripes, long since faded on the sleeve of his jacket, still seemed to command respect. J.D. made his way toward him, drawn by something unspoken in the man's stillness. The sergeant looked up as J.D. approached, eyes steady, not unkind. "I saw your parade, Senator," he said quietly. No bitterness in his tone, just weariness. His gaze drifted to the window, to where the city's cracked streets lay hidden beneath morning traffic. "We didn't need the tanks. We need the factories back." The words landed with a weight J.D. felt deep in his chest. Simple. Director. True. He pulled out a chair without asking, lowering himself across from the man, the piece of concrete in his pocket pressing against his side. A reminder he hadn't yet figured out what to do with. "You're right," J.D. said after a long moment. "That's what we need. That's what I need to figure out." The sergeant nodded as if to say he'd heard many promises in his life and would believe action when he saw it. Around them, the conversations continued, some voices still filled with pride at the morning show of might, others quiet with questions unspoken. J.D. felt them all, the pride, the weariness, the hope, and the doubt tangled together like the nation itself. And as he left the center, the door creaking shut behind him, J.D. carried more than the weight of failure now. He carried the responsibility that came with truly seeing, not the tanks, not the parade, but the people for whom it was meant, the ones who deserved more than steel rolling down cracked streets, the ones who still waited for factories to hum again, for towns to live again. The city's chill met him as he stepped back outside, but the resolve in J.D.'s heart burned warmer than before. The city lights glowed dim through the tall windows of J.D. Vance's office, casting fractured patterns across the floor, broken by the shadows of file cabinets and bookshelves lined with titles on law, history, and industry. The piece of concrete from the parade's aftermath sat on his desk, a rough gray reminder of the morning's scars. J.D. leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him, his eyes heavy but his mind restless. The parade replayed in his thoughts as vividly as if it were unfolding again outside his window. The tanks grinding over the city's streets, the hollow beat of drums echoing off silent buildings, the empty bleachers standing like monuments to promises unmet. He could almost hear the child's question once more. Why are they breaking the road? It stung now as much as it had in that moment, maybe more. J.D. reached for the remote and turned on the small television mounted in the corner. The news channels swarmed with commentary, split screens showing the parade on one side and pundits on the other, their expressions a mix of outrage and ridicule. "A monument to vanity," one anchor declared. "Millions wasted on a personal fantasy," another chimed in. The headlines scrolled beneath like a drumbeat of their own. "Parade flop embarrasses administration. Critics slam display as hollow spectacle." J.D. muted the sound, unable to bear the shallow certainty of voices that had never stood in that room with Trump, that had never heard the man's quiet plea. We have to remind them who we are. The world had seen arrogance. JD had seen desperation, a flawed attempt to stir a nation from its sleep. His reflection stared back at him in the darkened window, and for a moment he looked into his own doubt. Could he have done more? Should he have spoken louder, argued harder, urged another path? He had defended the intent, but the result, the cracked streets, the bitter headlines, the weariness in the veterans' eyes, was undeniable. The city outside hummed with life, indifferent to his turmoil. Cars passed below, their headlights sweeping the buildings in slow arcs. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, fading as it sped towards some unseen emergency. JD wondered if, in its own way, the nation was crying out too, and whether anyone was truly listening. He rested his elbows on the desk, head bowed, fingers steepled before his lips. The piece of concrete caught the faint light, its edges jagged, its surface pitted. A symbol of the damage done? Yes, but perhaps, if he chose, a symbol of what could be rebuilt. We can't let this be the end of the story, he whispered into the silence. The words not a declaration, but a promise to himself, to the people who had watched with pride, and those who had watched with disappointment, to the boy who had asked the question no adult dared to voice. The night deepened outside, the city settling into uneasy sleep. But J.D. Vance remained at his desk, eyes on the fragment of concrete, mind turning over the next steps. The parade had failed, but maybe, just maybe, it had shown him the beginning of the real work. The concrete shard felt heavier in J.D. Vance's pocket as he stepped off the train in Ohio. The night in his office still echoed in his mind, the weight of failure, the silent promise he had whispered to no one but himself. Now, as the cold morning air of the heartland filled his lungs, that promise pressed harder against him, urging him forward. He wasn't here for speeches or cameras. He was here to see with his own eyes what the parade had failed to touch. The town greeted him with a stillness that was almost reverent, or perhaps resigned. Streets that once bustled with workers on their way to shifts now lay empty. The only movement, the swirl of dry leaves skittering along cracked sidewalks. The factories, once the lifeblood of this place, stood like skeletons against the pale sky. Rusted gates locked with chains so old they seemed fused to the metal, windows shattered or boarded up, roofs sagging beneath years of neglect. J.D. walked slowly, taking it in. The weight of the scene settled deeper than any headline or report could. Here was the cost no parade could conceal. The tank tracks in D.C. had scarred the streets, but these broken mills, these empty lots, these were scars on the soul of a nation. He turned a corner and stopped short. A playground sat beside one of the shuttered mills, its chain-link fence torn and bent. A single swing creaked in the breeze, moving gently as if pushed by unseen hands. J.D. stared at it, the sound eerily loud in the hush of the abandoned town. The swing's rhythmic groan seemed to ask the question no one had answered. Where did everyone go? He didn't have to wonder long. At the edge of the lot, a small group of men stood in the shadow of a rusted water tower, their jackets faded, boots worn, faces lined by time and hardship. J.D. approached, nodding in greeting. They nodded back, wary but not unkind. One of them, a man with gray at his temples and grease beneath his nails that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed, spoke first. His voice was calm but carried a bite of truth sharper than any accusation. The parade didn't bring our jobs back, Senator. The words hit harder than 1,000 editorials. J.D. met the man's gaze, seeing not anger, but exhaustion, the weariness of promises heard and broken too many times. I know, J.D. said quietly. That's why I'm here. The man held his stare for a moment longer, then gave a small nod as if to say, then show us. Around them, the town seemed to hold its breath, the creak of the swing the only sound between them. J.D. stayed a while, listening more than speaking, letting the stories of layoffs and lost hope wash over him. And as he walked on, past the mills and the playground and the empty streets, he carried with him more than the weight of that piece of concrete. He carried the voices of the forgotten and a deeper understanding of what the next chapter had to be. Not parades, not displays, but rebuilding. The image of the swing, creaking in the wind beside the empty mill, lingered in JD's mind as he stepped into the modest town hall. The room smelled faintly of dust and old wood, the kind of place where generations had gathered, once to celebrate, now to search for answers. A faded American flag hung on the far wall, its colors dulled by time, but its presence a reminder of promises made and, for many here, broken. Chairs scraped softly against the worn floor as men and women took their seats, faces lined with worry, hope thinned by years of waiting. JD stood at the front for a moment, taking them in. The fathers who had once worked the mills, the mothers who held families together through layoffs and lean seasons, the teenagers who wondered if they'd ever have the chance their parents once did. He didn't start with a speech. He sat. The chair creaked under him, the room settling into a heavy silence. And then the voices came. Not angry at first, but tired, hearts too heavy for shouting. "They found money for tanks," a mother finally said, her voice steady but filled with quiet fury. "But not for us." She clutched a frayed coat around her, as if the words themselves had chilled her further. Her eyes met JD's, not in accusation, but in demand, for recognition, for action. The room murmured in agreement, not loud but enough to fill the space. JD felt the weight of those words settle deep, alongside the piece of concrete still in his pocket. He thought of the Veterans Center, of the old sergeant's truth. Now here it was again, spoken not in Washington, but in the voices of those who bore the brunt of forgotten promises. He listened as story after story unfolded. A father who used to supervise 50 men now piecing together work where he could. A grandmother raising her grandchildren on a pension stretched too thin. A young woman with eyes like steel who had once dreamed of college, now working double shifts at a diner to keep the lights on at home. JD didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect. He took it all in, their frustration, their disappointment, their quiet dignity. And with each story, his resolve grew. The room quieted again, the story spent for now. That's when the voice came, a small voice, from a boy no older than 8, his legs swinging beneath his chair, too short to reach the floor. He looked at JD with wide, serious eyes and asked the question that silenced even the hum of the old ceiling fan. "Mr. Vance, can you fix it?" For a heartbeat, JD couldn't speak. The question was so simple, so pure, cutting through politics, through headlines, through excuses. It was the question he had been asking himself since the tanks rolled down Constitution Avenue. "I'm going to try," he said at last, his voice low, steady, more promise than answer. The boy nodded, as if that was enough for now. And as the meeting ended and the townspeople filed out into the cold, JD stayed a moment longer, the boy's question echoing in his mind. He had come to listen, and now he left with a vow. Not loud, not for the cameras, but real. This couldn't be where their story ended. The train ride back to Washington felt longer than it should have. JD Vance sat by the window watching the landscape blur, a patchwork of fields, empty lots, and distant factories that no longer hummed with life. The boy's question followed him like a silent companion. "Mr. Vance, can you fix it?" Outside, the last light of day faded into a gray dusk, the kind that made the world seem suspended, waiting for someone to act. By the time JD unlocked the door to his office, night had settled fully over the city. The room greeted him with its familiar stillness, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls lined with books, files, and mementos of battles fought, some won, some still unfinished. He closed the door behind him and crossed to his desk, the worn soles of his boots quiet on the hardwood floor. With deliberate care, JD reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the piece of broken concrete he had carried since that morning after the parade. He held it in his palm for a long moment, feeling its cold weight, the jagged edges that seemed to bite into his glove. Then gently he placed it on the desk, beside a worn black and white photo of his grandfather. Mama's husband, a man who had worked steel and lived by a code of quiet strength. JD sank into his chair and stared at the two objects side by side. The cracked stone, the faded image of a man who had known what it meant to build rather than destroy. The city outside his window pulsed with distant headlights, sirens in the night, and the low hum of life continuing. But in this room, time seemed to still, the weight of what came next filling the silence. "We can't parade over broken streets anymore," JD whispered into the room, the words carrying more than regret. They carried a vow. The tanks, the fanfare, the empty seats, none of it had filled the void that haunted those towns he had just walked. No show of force could patch the cracks beneath a nation's feet. What was needed now wasn't spectacle, it was substance. His eyes remained fixed on that piece of concrete as thoughts began to take shape. Not grand declarations, not sweeping speeches, but plans. Real plans. Plans to redirect the story, to change the conversation from parades and pageantry to rebuilding what mattered, to fight for the funding that could bring back factories instead of more tanks rolling down city streets, to honor the intent behind the parade, not with hollow gestures, but with real action. JD reached for a notepad, his pen moving almost before he realized his hand had found it. Words filled the page. Ideas, connections, names of people he needed to call. This wasn't about salvaging pride. It was about fulfilling the promise that had been buried beneath broken asphalt and bitter headlines. Outside, the city moved on, but inside this small office, J.D. Vance began the work of turning failure into purpose. The concrete shard glinted softly in the lamplight, no longer just a reminder of what had gone wrong, but a symbol of the resolve that would shape what came next. The first light of dawn crept through J.D. Vance's office window, but he hadn't slept. The piece of concrete still sat on his desk, and beside it, pages now filled with notes, names, and sketches of something that might just matter. The night had been long, the kind that strips away illusion and leaves only truth. And the truth was clear. Speeches wouldn't fix what was broken. Parades wouldn't fill empty factories. If anything was to change, it would have to start now, and it would have to be real. JD rolled up his sleeves and picked up the phone. The hours that followed blurred into a steady rhythm of calls, meetings, and quiet, determined persuasion. First came the governors, those who understood, better than most, what hollowed-out towns looked like, what it felt like to stand in front of shuttered plants and explain to desperate people why help hadn't come. JD didn't promise miracles. He promised a fight worth having. Then came the allies of the president. Some answered with skepticism, their loyalty tangled with fear of appearing to contradict the public spectacle that had just failed so publicly. But JD spoke not of rejection, but of fulfillment. "The parade was meant to remind America of its strength," he said over and over, voice steady even as fatigue crept in. "Now we have a chance to prove that strength where it counts." Labor leaders came next, men and women who had long stopped expecting Washington to listen, but who listened now because JD wasn't offering photo ops or platitudes. He offered a plan, a real one that took the millions set aside for parades and discretionary displays and redirected them into industrial renewal. Grants for reopening factories, incentives for companies willing to invest in forgotten towns, funding for vocational training that could lift the next generation out of the shadows of abandoned mills. Night fell again, and JD found himself at a long table in a quiet side room of the Capitol, surrounded by tired but resolute faces, governors, aides, representatives of workers who had been waiting for this moment longer than he'd been in office. The room smelled of stale coffee and worn paper, and the only light came from a pair of desk lamps pushed together at one end of the table. JD's eyes burned from lack of sleep, bloodshot and dry, but the fire inside him burned hotter. Documents were passed, ideas debated, numbers scrawled on legal pads that quickly filled with calculations and compromises. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, then past 1, then 2. But no one left. No one wanted to be the first to break the momentum that, for the first time in too long, felt real. JD leaned over the table, hands braced on its scarred surface, his voice low but firm. "This isn't about saving face. This is about saving towns, saving families, saving what we say we stand for." Around him, heads nodded, not in agreement with every detail, not yet, but in agreement with the need, the urgency, the truth that could no longer be ignored. As the night wore on and plans began to take shape, JD allowed himself a moment to glance out the window. The city lay quiet, the streets beneath his gaze still cracked, still scarred, but maybe, just maybe, not beyond repair. The dawn that broke over Washington the next morning felt sharper, the chill in the air matching the edge JD sensed waiting for him beyond his office door. Word of his late-night meetings had spread faster than he'd anticipated. Before the sun had fully risen, the headlines began to surface, some speculative, some mocking. Vance's new mission? Can parade failure be polished into policy? From tanks to factories, J.D. Vance's pipe dream? He'd expected skepticism. He hadn't expected the venom that followed. By midday, the Capitol hummed with quiet derision disguised as casual commentary. Political rivals, some of whom had cheered the parade days earlier, now found easy targets in J.D.'s plan. In corridors and on cable shows, their words dripped with scorn. "He's just trying to cover up a disaster with promises he can't keep," one senator quipped, his smirk thinly veiled as concern. "Redirect parade funds? What's next? Turning White House tours into job training programs?" J.D. heard the whispers. He read the editorials. But the voices that stayed with him weren't those of his critics. They were the voices from the town halls, from the factory gates, from that boy who'd asked, "Can you fix it?" Still, it wasn't just rivals who raised doubts. In quieter moments behind closed doors, some of his own allies hesitated. Trusted colleagues, men and women who had stood with him on hard votes, now shifted uneasily as he laid out the plan they had helped shape. "Too risky, JD," one longtime friend said, his tone low, meant only for JD's ears. "You'll alienate Trump. He's proud of that parade, no matter what people say. If you push this too hard, you might lose him." Another voice, softer but no less worried. "We see what you're trying to do, but the timing's dangerous. The critics will spin this as you turning on him." JD listened. He understood their fear, not of failure, but of fracturing the fragile unity they'd worked so hard to build. He felt that fear himself, but beneath it, stronger, steadier, was the conviction that had carried him through those sleepless nights. He stood at his office window, looking out at the city's scarred streets, and let the weight of their warnings settle. Loyalty to Trump. Loyalty to the people. Was there truly a choice to be made between the two? In JD's heart, he saw no contradiction. The parade had been born of Trump's desire to remind America of its strength. JD's plan was not an insult to that intent, it was the fulfillment of it. "This isn't about turning on him," JD said aloud, though no one was there to hear. "It's about turning the intent into something real." He turned from the window, his gaze falling on the piece of concrete still resting on his desk. His hand brushed over it, feeling the rough edge that reminded him of the cracks beneath the surface, of streets, of promises, of the very foundation of trust between leaders and the elite. The resistance would grow louder, he knew. The voices of doubt would multiply, but so too would the need. And J.D. Vance had already made his choice. The road ahead would not be easy, but it would be honest. And for the people he'd met, for the towns he'd walked, for the boy who'd asked the question that haunted him still, "Can you fix it?" J.D. knew what had to come next. Long before the city stirred awake, J.D. Vance walked alone beneath the pale glow of streetlights that flickered against the soft blue of approaching dawn. The night's chill clung to his coat, but he welcomed it, the cold keeping him focused, sharp. The voices of doubt, of mockery, of fear that he might fracture his alliances. Those voices still echoed, but they were quieter here, muffled beneath the weight of history that surrounded him as he approached the Lincoln Memorial. The marble steps rose before him, worn smooth by generations who had come seeking answers, courage, hope. J.D. paused at the base, letting his gaze climb the great seated figure that watched over the city with solemn, unblinking eyes. The silence of the moment felt sacred, as if the very air demanded honesty. J.D. climbed the steps slowly, his boots soft against the stone, until he stood just beneath the shadow of the great man's gaze. He reached out, almost without thinking, and let his fingers brush the cool surface of the step beside him. It was solid, enduring, a reminder that some foundations could weather even the fiercest storms. "I fight for them," J.D. whispered, the words carried only as far as the marble columns around him. The ones no parade sees. He stood there a long time, watching as the first gold of morning touched the city, casting light on buildings still scarred by time, still waiting for promises kept. In that light, JD felt the weight of his choice crystallize, not as burden, but as purpose. The parade had failed. The critics were loud. The risks were real. But the need was greater. And so was the duty. JD descended the steps slowly, each one a silent promise renewed. The city below began to stir, headlights flickering on, street sweepers humming down avenues, joggers cutting through the dawn. But JD's focus was already on what came next. By the time he reached his office, the day had fully broken, and with it came a clarity that pushed aside fatigue. The piece of concrete still sat on his desk, beside his grandfather's photo. But now there was something new, a blank sheet of paper, and beside it, his pen. JD sat, drew a deep breath, and began to write. The words came slowly at first, but soon they flowed, shaped by the voices he'd heard, the faces he'd seen, the quiet question of a child that refused to fade. He titled it simply, America Works Again Act. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a press release. It was a blueprint. Grants for reopening factories, tax incentives for businesses that invested in forgotten towns, funding for apprenticeships and vocational training, infrastructure dollars to mend not just streets, but communities. Each line, each provision was written with care, with the determination to turn intent into impact. The morning sun streamed through the window as JD laid down his pen, his eyes heavy but his heart steady. The critics would come, the battles would be hard. But here at this desk, on this morning, JD Vance had taken the first step toward an answer. The concrete shard glinted in the sunlight, a reminder of where the work began and where it must lead. The House chamber was full that morning, though not with the usual hum of quiet conversations and shifting papers. There was a tension in the air, a sense that something different was about to unfold. JD Vance stood at the podium, his notes before him but untouched, his hands steady on the wood polished smooth by generations of speakers before him. The sun streamed through the high windows, casting light on faces that waited, some expectant, some skeptical, all watching. The piece of concrete sat in his coat pocket, its weight a reminder of every promise broken, every factory shuttered, every street cracked beneath parades that celebrated a strength too long unproven. JD took a breath, slow and deliberate, and let his eyes sweep the room. Colleagues, he began, his voice low but firm, carrying in the charged silence. We all stood on those cracked streets. We all watched as tanks rolled over them. And we all know this simple truth. If we can afford parades on broken roads, we can afford to rebuild those roads. And more than that, we can afford to rebuild the towns those roads lead to. There was a stir in the chamber, a ripple of recognition, perhaps even shame. JD pressed on, his voice gaining strength, his words no longer just for those in the room but for the millions watching beyond these walls. The America Works Again Act isn't about erasing a parade or covering up failure. It's about turning intention into action. It's about making good on the promise that was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the spectacle. A promise to the steelworker in Ohio, to the miner in West Virginia, to the child who asks, "Can you fix it?" He saw heads turning now, some among rivals, some among allies who had hesitated, afraid of alienating a president who had meant well, but whose vision had stumbled in execution. JD's voice softened, but the passion behind it only burned brighter. This is not a partisan issue. This is not about left or right. This is about right or wrong. We can stand here and fund symbols, or we can fund substance. We can praise strength with words, or we can prove strength with deeds. The America Works Again Act is our chance to choose the latter. JD's gaze locked on lawmakers he knew doubted him, those who had whispered of risk, of division, of politics. I stand here not against any man, not against any party. I stand here for the people we all swore to serve. And I ask you, when did rebuilding our nation become the risk? When did helping Americans working to stay afloat become too dangerous? The chamber was silent now, the usual coughs and shuffles gone. The weight of his words filled the space. JD knew the cameras were catching every moment, but he didn't speak for them. He spoke for the towns he had walked, for the mothers who had asked why tanks had funding when they did not, for the boy whose simple question still echoed in his heart. Let this be the day we stop parading over cracked streets. Let this be the day we start rebuilding them. And as JD stepped back from the podium, the silence held for a beat longer, and then came the sound. Not of applause alone, but of a chamber moved, uncertain, but stirred, perhaps, toward something more. The speech had barely ended before the storm began. By the time J.D. Vance returned to his office, the news cycles had already seized upon his words, spinning them into headlines designed less to inform than to inflame. Vance turns on Trump with factory plan, blared one network. J.D. Vance, from parade supporter to parade critic, flashed another. Pundits filled the airwaves, their voices urgent, as if America's very foundation trembled beneath the weight of a single speech. In interviews and editorials, rivals sharpened their blades. They painted JD's proposal not as a fulfillment of national promise, but as a betrayal, a calculated move to distance himself from the parade's failure, to rewrite history in his favor. He's covering his tracks, one congressman sneered on camera, his smile thin and cold, trying to salvage his reputation by throwing the president's vision under the bus. The words reached JD before the echo of his own speech had faded. His aides brought him reports, transcripts of talking heads dissecting every sentence, twisting his call for unity and rebuilding into an accusation of disloyalty. But JD didn't flinch. He stood at the window of his office. The city stretched below, streets still bearing the scars of tanks and time. His fingers brushed the piece of concrete on his desk, grounding him, reminding him why he had stood at that podium. "I'm not turning on him," JD said softly, more to himself than to the staffers who watched him with wary eyes. "I'm fulfilling his promise. I'm making good on his dream." The parade had been a symbol, a gesture meant to rouse a weary nation. JD's plan was the substance behind that symbol, the real strength Trump had wanted America to remember. He believed that. He clung to that truth even as the storm raged louder. Interviews were requested, statements demanded. JD chose his words with care, his voice steady across networks that tried to trap him in contradictions. "This isn't about defying the president," he told one anchor, meeting the camera's gaze without flinching. "It's about delivering on what he wanted most, a stronger America, not in show, but in fact." His words didn't silence the critics, but they complicated their narrative. Some of Trump's allies began to listen more closely, to hear the conviction beneath the noise. A few even called quietly, offering cautious encouragement. The battle lines, once drawn so clearly, now blurred at the edges. JD knew the fight was just beginning. The media storm would not pass quickly. Rivals would not surrender easy talking points. But as night fell over Washington again, JD felt no regret. His path was hard, yes, but it was honest. And as he looked out at the city, the cracked streets, the flicker of headlights, the quiet resilience of a nation waiting for more than parades, J.D. Vance steeled himself for the days ahead. This wasn't betrayal. This was purpose. And the true battle for America's soul was only beginning. Days of debate, scrutiny, and media frenzy blurred into one another as J.D. Vance worked behind the scenes, pressing the case for the America Works Again Act with a steady persistence that defied the storm around him. The critics hadn't let up. The headlines still crackled with accusations. But beneath the noise, something unexpected began to take root. Momentum. When the committee convened, few outside JD's closest circle believed the bill would clear its first hurdle. Pundits predicted it would stall, dismissed as political theater or a doomed attempt to cover for the parade's fallout. But JD had done what parades never could. He had built coalitions, quiet conversations with governors, labor leaders, and even skeptical members of Congress had laid the foundation. JD hadn't shouted. He'd listened, reasoned, and negotiated. And so, when the final vote was counted, the result startled the Capitol. The bill advanced, narrowly but decisively, out of committee. The headlines shifted in tone, some grudging, some breathless with surprise. Vance turns parade shame into policy win, read one. Factory bill clears first test. Can it survive the floor? Asked another. Cable news anchors who had mocked JD's efforts just days earlier now spoke of his unexpected savvy, his unlikely coalition building, his quiet but growing influence. JD followed the reports with measured detachment. He hadn't done this for the headlines. He hadn't fought for approval or praise. But he couldn't deny the flicker of satisfaction, the sense that, at least for now, he had begun to turn failure into purpose. In the privacy of his office that night, JD sat alone, the piece of concrete still on his desk, his grandfather's photo beside it. The capital was quiet now, the city beyond settling into another night. JD allowed himself a breath, a moment of reflection, but not celebration. He knew the real test lay ahead. The committee vote was only the first step. The floor debate would be fiercer, the stakes higher, the resistance stronger. Rivals would sharpen their attacks, allies might falter, and the storm of media scrutiny would intensify. But JD welcomed the fight. He rose and crossed to the window, looking out at the city's streets, still cracked, still waiting. The victory in committee had not filled those factories, had not mended those roads, but it had opened a door. And JD Vance intended to walk through it. The headlines continued to roll in, some supportive, some skeptical, all acknowledging the shift. But JD didn't read them for long. There was work to do. The real battle had only just begun. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint tang of dew and steel as JD Vance stepped onto the grounds of the mill. The sky glowed with the soft gold of dawn, casting long shadows across the gravel lot, where men and women gathered in quiet anticipation. There were no banners strung across the gates, no brass bands to herald the occasion, no cameras flashing to catch stage smiles. This was not a spectacle. It was something far rarer, far more real. The mill, silent for years, now hummed with the first low stirrings of renewed life. The gates, once locked and rusting, now stood open, and through them streamed workers in faded jackets and clean hard hats that caught the rising sun, sending glints of light across the yard. JD stood a step apart, watching them file in. Not as a guest of honor, not as a politician seeking applause, but as a witness to a promise kept. The clatter of boots on concrete, the soft exchange of greetings between old friends, the bark of a foreman calling out shift instructions. These were the sounds that filled the air. And as JD took it in, a swell of pride rose in his chest, deeper and truer than anything he had felt watching tanks roll down Constitution Avenue. This is the parade that matters, JD thought, the words forming quietly, meant for no one but himself. He glanced toward the mill's main building, where smoke curled from a stack that had been cold so long, it seemed the sky itself had forgotten it. The smell of oil, of heated metal, of purpose filled the air. This was the strength that had built America, the strength that parades tried to honor, but could never match. An older worker passed by, pausing just long enough to meet JD's eye and nod. No words, no speeches, just the silent acknowledgement between men who understood what it had taken to get here. JD returned the nod, his throat tight with emotion he wouldn't let show. The committee vote, the floor fights, the endless interviews, the sleepless nights, they had all led to this. A small beginning, perhaps, but a beginning nonetheless. JD knew the cameras would come later, when headlines were needed, when politicians wanted their share of the credit. But today, this moment belonged to the workers, the men and women who would reclaim not just paychecks, but pride. JD lingered as the shift assembled, as the machinery inside the mill roared to full life, as the rhythmic beat of industry replaced the hollow drums of failed parades. He breathed it all in, the sound, the smell, the energy of purpose reborn. And as the sun climbed higher, casting the mill in warm light, JD Vance felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that didn't depend on words or gestures, but on deeds. The road ahead was still long. There would be more votes, more battles, more towns waiting their turn. But here, in this yard on this morning, JD allowed himself a quiet moment of victory. This, he whispered, watching the workers vanish into the belly of the mill, is the strength we meant to show all along. The steady rhythm of the mill's machinery became the heartbeat of the town once more. Days turned into weeks, and with each sunrise, something long dormant began to stir. Not just inside the factory walls, but across the streets, the storefronts, and the lives that had waited so long for reason to hope again. Small businesses that had darkened their windows and locked their doors in quiet surrender now began to dust off counters, flip signs to open, and welcome customers who no longer carried only worry in their wallets. The old hardware store, the barber shop, the corner grocery, all places that had stood as reminders of what was lost, now stood as signs of what was returning. Schools, too, felt the change. With new funding tied to the America Works Again Act, programs once slashed to the bone began to come back. Vocational classes reopened. Workshops buzzed with the sound of young hands learning skills their parents had feared were gone forever. A wood shop filled again with the smell of sawdust and promise. A metal shop echoed with the clang of hammers. And in classrooms, teachers spoke of futures that seemed possible, not just theoretical. J.D. Vance saw it all not through news reports or staff briefings, but with his own eyes. He came without entourage, without cameras, as he always had. On this day, he found himself at a small diner that had once been barely more than empty booths and coffee that stayed too long on the warmer. Now the tables were full, the air alive with conversation, and the aroma of fresh eggs and frying bacon filled the room with a kind of warmth no parade could ever match. J.D. sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted better, simply because it was shared with people who had reason to smile again. The waitress, who had served him during those darker days, set down his plate with a wink. "On the house today, Senator. You earned it." Around him the talk was of shifts starting, of paychecks earned, of kids enrolling in programs that offered more than just tests and textbooks. J.D. listened more than he spoke, taking in the music of a town finding its voice again. Then came the moment that stayed with him most. A boy, no more than 9 or 10, slid onto the stool beside him. His hair was still damp from a rushed morning shower, his boots just a little too big, as if borrowed from an older brother. He looked up at J.D. with eyes that held no pretense, no politics, just truth. "Mr. Vance," the boy said, his voice clear and sure, "you kept your promise." J.D. felt the words settle deep, the kind of weight that wasn't burden, but purpose. He smiled, but it wasn't just a smile of thanks. It was a smile of commitment, because keeping one promise meant making another. To keep going, to keep building, to make sure this revival wasn't a single spark, but a lasting flame. The diner door chimed as another worker came in, and the town's day continued. But for J.D., the boy's words rang louder than any cheer from any crowd. There was no announcement, no entourage, no grand staging when J.D. Vance returned to the heart of the town. The mill's hum was steady now, a rhythm that seemed to steady the town with it. The businesses that had flickered back to life bustled quietly. The school windows shone with light as students and teachers filled classrooms with the sound of a future being rebuilt. J.D. walked those streets at dawn, the air cool and clean. The sky streaked pink and gold where morning reached across the rooftops. There were no bands, no flags waving in the breeze, no brass horns to announce his presence. But the people noticed. From shop windows, from front stoops, from behind the counters of the businesses they had fought to save, they saw him, and they nodded. No applause, no spectacle, just nods of respect, of recognition between those who had endured and those who had helped them endure. J.D. returned each one with a nod of his own, the weight of their quiet gratitude more meaningful than any cheer could have been. The media caught it, of course. Cameras, always searching for the unexpected, found him walking alone down Main Street. No speech prepared, no headline sought. The photo ran in papers and on screens with captions that varied. A senator's quiet victory. From parades to purpose, J.D. Vance walks the street he helped rebuild. But J.D. didn't walk for the cameras. He walked because he needed to see it, to feel it beneath his boots, to know it was real. And as he walked, his hand found the piece of concrete in his pocket, the same shard he had picked up from the cracked streets of D.C. that morning after the parade. Its edges were still rough, its weight unchanged, but its meaning had deepened. It was no longer just a symbol of failure. It was a reminder of how far they had come and of how far there still was to go. He passed the diner, where the boy's words still echoed in his mind. "You kept your promise." He passed the mill gate, where the clatter of work filled the air. He passed the schoolyard, where the swing that had once creaked in loneliness now swayed with the joyful push of a father home from his shift, his daughter's laughter rising above the hum of the town. Each step felt like part of a different kind of parade, the only kind that mattered, not one of tanks and spectacle, but one of purpose, of people returning to work, of streets filling with life, of towns no longer forgotten. JD paused at the edge of town, where the road stretched toward the horizon, lined by fields that had waited as patiently as the people. He looked back once, taking in the simple beauty of what they had begun. Not finished, but begun. The cameras clicked in the distance, but he didn't hear them. His mind was on the next step, the next town, the next promise. His fingers closed around the piece of concrete in his pocket, and with a quiet conviction, he spoke the words that would guide him forward. "Let's keep building." The morning was quiet but purposeful as J.D. Vance stood at the edge of Constitution Avenue, hands in his coat pockets, watching as the city's scars were slowly mended. The streets that had groaned beneath the weight of steel beasts during that ill-fated parade were now lined with orange cones and work crews. Jackhammers rattled rhythmically, loaders moved piles of broken asphalt, and crews in neon vests and hard hats worked in practiced harmony to lay down fresh pavement where cracks and gouges had once been. It wasn't glamorous. There were no grand speeches, no cameras capturing the moment for the evening news. But to JD, the sight of those crews, their sleeves rolled, their brows damp despite the crisp air, was more meaningful than any headline. He crossed to a food truck parked at the corner, where some of the workers gathered for their first break of the morning. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mingling with the scent of hot tar and dust. JD accepted a cup of coffee offered by the vendor, nodding his thanks, and joined a group leaning against the bumper of a work truck. The talk was easy, unforced, the way conversations go among people who know the worth of work well done. They spoke of the job ahead, of their kids' school plays, of the game that night. JD listened, the warmth of the coffee in his hands grounding him in the simple reality of this moment. One man older, his beard streaked with gray beneath his hard hat, turned to JD with a half smile. "Didn't think we'd be fixing these streets quite so soon," he said, voice gruff but good-natured. JD chuckled softly, the sound carried off on the breeze. "Neither did I, but I'm glad we are." The man nodded, gaze drifting back to the crew at work. "Feels good to be doing something that lasts." JD sipped his coffee, letting the words sink in. Around him the city's heart beat steady, not with the hollow drum of parades, but with the hum of honest repair. This was what rebuilding looked like, not in grand gestures, but in the daily work of many hands, in the steady laying down of stone over cracks, of trust over cynicism. This is what leadership repairs, JD thought, the words forming quietly within him. Not just streets, but faith. Not just asphalt, but connection between those who served and those they served. As the break ended and the workers returned to their tasks, JD lingered for a moment longer, watching as the sun climbed higher, catching the sheen of fresh pavement, the bright flash of tools in motion. The city, wounded but not broken, moved one step closer to wholeness. And as JD turned to leave, he felt the weight of the concrete piece in his pocket, the reminder of where this journey had begun and how much further there was to go. The scent of sawdust and machine oil greeted JD Vance as he stepped into the vocational school's workshop. A warm, familiar aroma that spoke of effort, of learning, of futures being shaped by steady hands and sharpened minds. The building, once shuttered due to budget cuts and declining enrollment, now hummed with life. Sunlight streamed through high windows, catching motes of dust in golden beams that fell across workbenches, tool racks, and young faces filled with focus. JD paused near the entrance, watching unnoticed for a moment as students bent over projects. A boy no older than 16, guided a piece of steel beneath the sparks of a welder's torch, his concentration so complete he didn't seem to hear the instructor's quiet encouragement. Nearby, a girl with her sleeves rolled to the elbow measured twice before making her careful cut through a length of wood, her brows furrowed in determination. There was no show here, no staged moment for the cameras. Just real work, real learning. JD let it fill him, the energy of the room, the quiet pride in the student's posture, the sense of purpose so often absent in places that had been left behind. A teacher noticed him then and crossed the room, wiping his hands on a worn rag. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his face lined by years of teaching not just subjects, but resilience. "Senator Vance," the man said, extending a firm hand. "Didn't expect you today." JD shook his hand, nodding toward the students. "I wanted to see it with my own eyes." The teacher glanced back at the room, watching as a group of teens gathered around a lathe, their instructor guiding them through the first careful turns. His voice softened. "You changed their future, Senator." JD felt the words settle in his chest, humbling and heavy all at once. "They're the ones changing it," he replied. "I just helped open the door." The two men stood in quiet companionship for a moment, listening to the rhythm of tools, the murmur of instruction, the low hum of machinery. JD's gaze moved across the room again, to the girl at the saw, to the boy at the welder, to the groups clustered at workstations, their eyes bright with the fire of purpose. These were not just students. They were builders. Builders of homes, of businesses, of towns, of the very fabric of the nation. JD felt a quiet gratitude that the America Works Again Act had helped make this possible. The tour continued, through classrooms where electrical circuits blinked to life beneath careful fingers, through garages where engines were taken apart and rebuilt by hands learning the art of precision. JD took it all in, not as a senator seeking credit, but as a man grateful to witness the first true fruits of a promise kept. As he left, the sound of the workshop stayed with him, as steady and real as the heartbeat of the town outside. JD touched the concrete shard in his pocket, feeling its familiar weight, a reminder of cracks mended and of the work still ahead. The last light of day bathed the city in a soft, golden haze as JD Vance made his way to the Veterans Memorial. The streets were quiet now, the hum of machinery replaced by the hush that comes when a city exhales at dusk. He walked without entourage, without fanfare, the concrete shard in his pocket weighing heavier than ever. Not as burden, but as memory, as purpose. The memorial stood solemn beneath the open sky, its stone walls etched with the names of those who had given everything, its silence deeper than any speech could reach. JD paused at its edge, taking in the rows of flags unmoving in the still evening air, the gentle glow of lights that would soon guide the night. He stepped forward, each footfall slow, deliberate, until he stood at the base of the monument. With care, he drew the piece of concrete from his pocket, feeling the rough edges one last time. Then kneeling, he placed it on the ground, a small token among so many greater sacrifices. The shard caught the fading light, its cracks visible, its story known now only to him and the silent stone. JD bowed his head, his voice low, meant only for the evening breeze. Strength isn't what rolls down a street, it's what builds it back up. He remained there a moment longer, the weight of the journey settling into peace, not of completion, but of commitment renewed. Then he rose, turning from the monument, his figure framed by the soft glow of the city beyond. Without a word, without looking back, JD walked away, quiet but steadfast, the path ahead long, but the purpose clear. This story reminds us that true strength is not measured by displays of power, but by the quiet, determined work of rebuilding what's broken. JD Vance's journey shows how leadership is not about pride or parades, but about listening, acting, and standing by promises when the cameras are gone. It's a reminder that real change happens not in grand gestures, but in small, steady steps that restore dignity and hope. His path urges us to reflect. In our own communities, are we choosing to build up or simply to impress? What do you believe is the strongest thing we can do for each other today? Let us know in the comments. Your voice matters. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.